to help us mark Armistice Day, Veterans Day. John Pavlic, 88 years old, of West Allis, Wisconsin, was an ambulance driver on various fronts. Herbert Houston, also 88, of Chattanooga, Tennessee, was an infantryman in the Marines. And George Vaughn Jr., 91 years old, of New York City, was a fighter pilot who shot down 13 planes in his tour of duty. I asked them all about their experience overseas in combat. Mr. Vaughn was a student at Princeton when he signed up, and I asked him what he went over to do.
Well, I went over to fly in the Air Force. At Princeton, as I said before, where I started, I was a sophomore. There was a group of people there who were particularly interested in aviation. Most of us remembered the flight of the Wright brothers in 1903. And obviously, if we were going to get into the war at all, we wanted to get into the flying end of it.
Tell me about the kinds of airplanes you flew and what kind of armament they had on them.
The ones that I flew particularly were what we used to call scouts. Now they're called fighters, but they were single-seated jobs designed particularly for air combat.
With a single stick control?
Single stick control, usually 2 machine guns firing straight forward, so that you aimed the whole airplane, you didn't aim the guns.
Did you ever get in tough scrapes?
A tough scrape?
Tough scrapes.
Oh yes, I've been in tough scrapes.
What kind?
Well, the first time I went over the lines, I was being shown the front lines by the veteran British officers who were running the show at the time. And all of a sudden I was conscious of the fact that a machine gun was firing behind me. I looked around and there was the nose of a big yellow German aircraft shooting at me. Fortunately, he didn't have the aim quite right, and he just hit the tailplanes of my aircraft. But that was the first time I had been subject to fire.
That's your first time?
This fellow shot at me before I even knew he was there, because I just was a neophyte at that time and didn't know what was going on. And I finally turned around and got into combat with him and shot him down. That was the first time.
Mr. Houston, you were in the trenches, weren't you?
Right.
So much is made of what a brutal war and the hand-to-hand combat in that war. You were part of all that?
Yes, sir.
What was it like?
Hell. 4-letter word. The front that we were taken to first to relieve the French was supposed to have been a rest area. Being Americans, we changed that, and we had a scrap the first night, lost 1 man and a few casualties. They found out who was over there. Why, we had some scraps every few days and continuous artillery fire while I was in the trenches. We were there 2 months with a week off every 4th week.
You were wounded yourself, were you not?
Yes, I know what it means.
How were you wounded?
Well, the main wound I got is gas.
Mustard gas?
Mustard gas. I carry it with me all the time. Both of my legs now are taped. Burns of 70 years. Never healed. Scab over. But for 16 weeks now they've been on their machines to take the fluid out once a week.
Mr. Pavlic, you were doing what over there?
I was assigned to an ambulance company at World War I. That was the first time that they had motorized vehicles for ambulance services. Before it was horse-drawn or mule-drawn vehicles.
And I would suspect you saw some pretty torn-up soldiers.
Oh, yes. When I was on detached duty there with the infantry, all we had no penicillin, no sulfa drugs, none of those things. All we had is a bandage with a compress in the center, 2 tails, and when the guy was wounded, come up to you didn't bother about taking his clothes or doing anything. You took that bandage, that compress, slapped it over the wound, brought it around, tied it so you stopped the bleeding and so forth. And most of our people that we were taking were slightly wounded. Those that were seriously wounded had to be carried on stretchers. And, of course, when we were taking them back to our station, you could only take 4 stretcher litters, where otherwise you could take probably 12 13, 14 men. They'd hang on to any place on fenders and so forth to get them back.
So many people just look at this Armistice Day now as, you know, as one more holiday. Do you think most people remember what the origin of Armistice Day was?
It's hard to tell. Certainly no one with a gray hair like ours questions it.
I think the reason that they don't remember Armistice Day is because Armistice Day was replaced with Veterans Day. And since our war, we've got more veterans of the other wars, and therefore nobody knows anything about Armistice Day, what actually took place and so forth. When we celebrated Armistice Day, the civilians, for years, we used to, at 11 o'clock, everything stopped. Streetcars would stop, the people would, wherever they were on the street, they'd stop, face east for 2 minutes. Church bells would be ringing, the whistles would be blowing, and so forth. And that carried on for several years after the war ended.
Mr. Vaughn, I'll give you the last word on this. How do you react?
Well, I think the war that we were in was quite different from the more recent ones. Maybe not World War II, but certainly different from Korea, because we really thought that this was going to be the war to end all wars, and this was going to be it. And we were happy to be a part of any movement that would contribute to that end. And that's the way we felt about it. We were fighting for a cause. We weren't fighting certain people. But we did think that we were, or hoped at least, that we were producing something worthwhile.
Mr. Vaughn, 91 years old, the other two, 88. Heroes all. We'll be back.
Our first guest today is one of America's true pioneers of military aviation. A man who, from a rooftop in Brooklyn, actually watched the Wright Flyers fly over New York City. Born in 1897, George Vaughn attended Princeton University and, along with a few other aviation enthusiasts, founded one of the first aero clubs of any university in America. He learned to fly the Curtiss Jenny at Princeton, but left to enlist in the aviation branch of the Army Signal Corps when America entered World War I in 1917. He was accepted into the first school of military aviation and graduated after 60 weeks of basic flight training. Private Vaughn traveled to England in the fall of 1917 to train as a combat pilot, completing his basic training at the Oxford School of Aeronautics. He found the quarters in Scotland quite satisfactory for advanced flying training, where he learned to fly the aircraft in which he first saw combat, the SC-5. Once assigned to the Royal Flying Corps, number 84 Squadron in France, he found the accommodations somewhat different. Recently commissioned, Lieutenant Vaughn first saw combat in May of 1918. Within the short span of 3 months, he downed 6 enemy aircraft and earned the coveted title of ace. In August of the same year, he transferred to the 4th Pursuit Group. He also transitioned to the Sopwith Camel and was assigned as B-Flight Commander in the 17th Aero Squadron. Lieutenant Vaughn is shown here leading on an aircraft tie-down spike with other members of B-Flight in September of 1918. It is interesting to note that of these 4 young aviators, 2 were killed in action and 1 was shot down and taken prisoner. Only Lieutenant Vaughn survived the war on the Allied side of no man's land. In less than 2 months of combat with the 17th Squadron, he shot down another 6 aircrafts, becoming a double ace. He added a balloon to his credit before the armistice, bringing his total of confirmed aerial victories to 13. After the war, he had the unique honor of being featured in the famous aviator series of Heinz Breakfast Wheat. Lieutenant Vaughn retained his affiliation with aviation and helped organize the first National Guard Aero Squadron in New York in 1921, rising to the position of its commander prior to his retirement as Lieutenant Colonel in 1937. He co-founded the Academy of Aeronautics in the 1930s, which trained thousands of aviation technicians before and during World War II. Ladies and gentlemen, we are doubly proud to have Mrs. Marion Vaughn with us today. Mrs. Vaughn, would you please stand up? Vaughns came all the way from Staten Island to be with us today, and we're especially appreciative because they were here not 3 weeks ago to support SOS on a similar function. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming a great American, a true warrior who risked his life in the Great War, the kid from Brooklyn, Lieutenant Colonel George Vaughn. Colonel Vaughn, you started your aviation career in an era which none of us have touched. Can you tell us something about why you got interested in flying and how you chose it as a career?
Well, I suppose I got interested in flying chiefly because the Wright brothers flew their first airplane when I was very young, and the papers were full of stories of the Wright brothers and their airplane, and I became interested in the thing. And later became interested in model building models of the Wright brothers airplane and models of the Glenn H. Curtiss airplane and some of the foreign airplanes that came out in the early 1900s. Then, as you said, I think in the introduction, I was born in Brooklyn, and one of the early air shows, we would call them, I guess, today, was a meeting of some of the early flyers at Belmont Park, which was a racetrack on Long Island. And one of the features of this particular meeting was a race from Belmont Park out around the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor and back to Belmont Park again. It happened that the route of that race went right over the house where I lived in Brooklyn, and I used to go up on the roof and watch them go by. So I suppose that's the way the interest really started. And I'm talking now about an area someplace around 1912 or something like that.
Very good. You went to Princeton, 1915, 1916 time frame, and you furthered your interest and learned to fly while you were at Princeton. Can you tell us something about the Aero Club that was formed there and how you learned to fly?
Well, that was an interesting story. Of course, we had no Air Force in those days. The only flying in the services was well, originally there was a small squadron of Curtiss Jenny airplanes which flew with General Pershing when he went after Pancho Villa in an expedition into Mexico sometime before World War I. There was one squadron of airplanes that went down on that Mexican expedition. They were not conceived of as fighting machines. They were conceived of as carrier pigeons in those days. They felt that they could carry messages for the Signal Corps probably faster than a man on horseback. So the aviation section became a section of the Signal Corps. And that's the way aviation started, military aviation started in this country, was the aviation section of the Signal Corps. Because, as I say, the conception was the airplane not as a fighting instrument, but as a means of communication and also possibly a means of observation over the enemy lines. From that point on, there wasn't very much development when World War I started, but a lot of people in the United States had decided before we got into the war in 1917 that this war was a pretty worthwhile enterprise and that they might get in it. And so there were literally hundreds of Americans who went over and joined the flying services of some of the foreign countries, notably France and England. There was one particular group went over to France for their training who formed what was later well known as the Lafayette Escadrille, made up all of Americans who were trained with the French and flew French airplanes and were actually members of the French Army. They weren't military people at all. There was a lot of publicity about that organization. Some of our public-spirited alumni at Princeton University thought it would be a wonderful idea if, in addition to a Lafayette escadrille, there was a Princeton escadrille that went over there and joined the fight in Europe. And so they decided that they would form a flying club in Princeton of those who might be interested. They would buy a couple of airplanes, and they did this with their own money. They would rent a field between Princeton and Lawrenceville where we would learn to fly. They proceeded along these lines. They brought these airplanes in about May of 1917. The airplanes were delivered. And then they went down to Washington, and at that time General Squire was head of the Signal Corps. They said, General Squire, we now have the makings of a Princeton escadrille, which we're going to send overseas. We want your full cooperation, and what can you do to help us? They hoped, of course, that General Squire would take over the school and start a military school there. They were very much disappointed when they found that this couldn't happen, because there was a little problem involved with flyers in those days. You had to be a commissioned officer, and in order to be a commissioned officer, you had to be at least 21 years old and be a college graduate. The members of this school were neither 21 years old nor were they college graduates, so they were not suitable for commissions. But at any rate, General Squire finally agreed to start a school of military aeronautics, which was a ground school at Princeton University, where prospective flyers could be trained in the fundamentals of mechanics, air communication, such as it was by dot-dash telegraph, a little bit of navigation, a little bit of meteorology, a little bit of some of the things that went with flying. This group of 25, all of those who could pass the physical examination, and there were some who couldn't, of course, all signed up as privates in the Signal Corps at this point. Pay, incidentally, $33 a month. And as privates in the Signal Corps, we constituted the first flight of the first school at the School of Military Aeronautics at Princeton. In the meantime, just before we went into the ground school, we had each been permitted to solo the airplane once out at the flying field, and then we were considered graduated as pilots. We were through that. One solo was a graduation.
Very good. After your completion of your one solo and graduation, enlisted in the Signal Corps, and you were going to be trained for combat. However, you didn't train for combat in the United States. Can you tell us why?
Well, there were no planes to train on in the United States. As I said before, the only aircraft built in the United States up at that point was the Curtiss Jenny. There were a few other miscellaneous craft that were built, but the only ones that were built in a quantity with the Curtiss Jenny. And that was strictly a training aircraft. I don't think anybody ever put a gun on a Curtiss Jenny, and certainly never carried any bombs. But it was the only thing available. Furthermore, there was nobody in this country who had any wartime experience. We didn't know anything about military aviation at all in those days. All we knew was that maybe, as I say, an airplane could be useful in some way, carrying messages or doing observation work. There were no facilities for training of combat pilots here in the U.S. So after we graduated from ground school, we were given a choice, believe it or not, whether we would like to go to Italy, to France, or to England for training. Well, this was September of 1917. We thought Italy sounded pretty good for the winter, so we all signed up to go to Italy. And we became known as the Italian detachment. We went down to what is now Mitchell, what used to be Mitchell Field, the old Mineola flying field in Long Island. There we joined up with a larger group of several other, that had come from several other universities. They had these schools of military aeronautics by this time, and there's 6 other universities. And so finally grew up there a group of about 200 of us all together, all still first-class privates in the Signal Corps, who were due to go overseas for training. We were known as the Italian detachment. One of our supply officer was one of Fiorello LaGuardia, who was an Italian at that point, had been a congressman and had wangled himself somehow or other commissioned as a captain straight from civilian life. I guess because he was a captain, because he was a congressman. But anyway, he could speak Italian, obviously, being of Italian birth. And so all the way overseas, and it took us 2 weeks to go overseas in those days because every ship had to travel at the speed of the slowest ship in the convoy. Every day during our cruise overseas, we studied all morning under LaGuardia. We studied Italian. Well, we were quite proficient in Italian by the time we got to England, by the time we got to Liverpool, only to find out that we weren't going to Italy at all. Typically, we were going to stay right there in England for our training, which we proceeded to do. And we were almost immediately assigned to a school of military aeronautics, exactly like the School of Military Aeronautics we had already graduated from the United States. This was at Oxford University. So we went to Oxford University and went through another ground school, and there we joined up with some of the British cadets and so forth. We got to be known then, although we still were actually privates first class, we got to be known at this point as cadets rather than privates. This was not an official title in the U.S. Army. There was no such thing except at West Point. But anyway, we became cadets, and instead of having first-class private things on our sleeves, we wore a white headband around the campaign hat, which was the uniform in those days, signifying that we were cadets, not privates anymore.
Excellent. After the school at Oxford, you then went to advanced combat training up at Aero Scotland, where we saw the castle that you lived in. Can you tell us something about what your training was like in Scotland? Maybe the type aircraft you flew, what they taught you in preparation to go into combat across France?
Well, it wasn't all Scotland. We went to 4 or 5 other different flight schools before we got to Scotland Air. First, we had to transfer from the Jennies, which we'd flown in the United States just once, as I said before, and collect some time in that type of aircraft. The Royal Air Force, or in those days the Royal Flying Corps, had brought a certain number of these Curtiss Jennies from the United States. And the ones that we learned to fly in the United States had wheel depth control. So we'd never flown one with a stick control. So the British had converted theirs to stick control so that they would simulate the aircraft that were used in combat. And we had to do the transition from depth control to stick control. Then we had to do the transition from the Jenny to the Avro, which was a British airplane with a rotary engine in it, which was particularly good for acrobatic training and this sort of thing. And then from the Avro into the Sopwith Pup, which was a single-seated airplane with a rotary engine, had been used briefly as a combat aircraft, but had not been particularly successful because it wasn't strong enough. And then from there, we went into the SC-5, which was the actual combat airplane we were to fly overseas. And that was the airplane we flew when we got up to Air in Scotland. The school in Air in Scotland had been developed. It was known officially as a school of aerial fighting. It was manned by Britishers who had had wide experience with actual fighting at the front. They lectured to us. They demonstrated the rudimentary tactics that we had in those days with the simple aircraft that we had to work with. They put camera guns on the top of some of these SE-5 airplanes, and they would go up once a week. Every Monday they would divide the school into 2 halves, the reds and the whites, or the reds and the greens, or whatever they were. And they would go up and actually engage in simulated combat. One group tried to hide in the sun or something to sneak up on the other group, but they had to abandon that before too long because each of these combats resulted in 5 or 6 casualties. People crashed into each other, getting overzealous with their dogfighting and that sort of thing. So that was finally abandoned.
We don't have that problem today.
Don't have that problem. No, I suppose not.
Sarcasm there, sir. Excellent. So after finishing your advanced training, your combat training in Scotland, you became a ferry pilot for a while and eventually ferried an aircraft into France and arrived very close to the front lines. Can you tell us what it was like showing up very close to the front lines, the war had been going on for several years? How were you introduced to the combat theater as a pilot, and can you relate your very first experience of being shot at or engaging in combat with another aircraft?
Well, I was introduced to actually being under fire in rather peculiar circumstances. As you say, after completing the school at the Air, I went into ferry piloting for a while. The SE-5s were built in England, and we ferried them across the channel and delivered them in France. So that I had built up, by the time I got ready to actually go to the front, a total of some 90 hours of flying, which in those days was a tremendous number of hours for anybody who was arrived at the front. There was an epidemic of influenza at that point among the troops in France. And I no sooner got there than I came down with the flu and was sent to a British military hospital on the French coast. And while I was there, this city and hospital and everything else that it had to do with it was very severely bombed all one night by the German Air Force. And so my first experience with air combat wasn't air combat at all. It was sitting under a bed hiding from bombs dropping from the sky from something that I'd never even seen before. It wasn't a very pleasant experience, I might add. I'd be much rather be shot at in the air than to be sitting underneath waiting for a bomb to hit.
Sure. So when you arrived in France again, you got airborne, or you had some rudimentary training, introduction to the theater again, and you were being led on a flight over the lines. Can you tell us the very first time you saw an enemy aircraft? How did you know he was there, and what kind of success did you have?
That's a good question, because I didn't know he was there. That was if I had known he was there, it might have been an entirely different picture. And if he had been a better shot than he was, it would have been a very different picture, especially from my standpoint. When we first went to the front lines, of course, we were taken over by our flight commander, as a rule, for familiarization with the territory around. And this was very important in those days because I guess more people got lost in flight than ever got shot down in combat. There were no navigational facilities, no facilities of any kind except what you could see on the ground. So it was very important to familiarize yourself with the territory over which you were flying so that you knew where you were all the time. So the first couple of weeks we were actually at the front was spent mostly just flying over the territory to see what it looked like so we knew where we were. If we did get in a scrap or something, we'd know the way home. This was a very important part. But to get back to the other story, when we finally did go over the lines, we were taken over in a very gingerly fashion by our relatively cautious flight commander. And I didn't suspect that there was anything hostile in the air or anywhere near where we were. There hadn't been up to that point. And the first thing I knew, I was conscious of the machine gun fire from the rear, and I looked around at a great yellow nose of a German Pfalz was practically in my rear cockpit. I didn't know he was in the sky. I didn't have the slightest idea there was an enemy aircraft around. So that was the first great lesson I had. Keep watching in behind all the time.
That hasn't changed.
Fortunately, he hit only the tailplane of my airplane. He didn't hit anything serious. And that actually turned into my first victory because I'd been taught in the school what to do if somebody came up behind. And so I made a quick left climbing turn, got around behind this fellow without paying any attention to what else there might be in the sky at all. And finally did get behind him because he just started straight for home and flew in a straight line, and I was able to shoot him down. Much to the chagrin of my flight commander, who realized that there were a number of other aircraft in the sky at that time waiting to pounce on him. But because I followed this fellow so far toward the west, he was duty obligated to follow me too. So I had to take the whole squadron in way over their heads as far as when I got back, instead of being criticized for shooting something down, I got bawled out for taking the squadron in dangerous place.
Well, outstanding. You did very well with the British in a very brief span of time, about three months. You downed 6 aircraft and a balloon. Now, many of us think of shooting down a balloon as a relatively easy task, pretty large target, very stationary. Can you tell us something about what it was like to try to shoot down a balloon?
Well, it wasn't easy at all. Let's put it that way. It was a very difficult thing to do. As a matter of fact, it's true, the balloon was a great big target. You couldn't possibly miss it with a machine gun. But the balloon, of course, was full of hydrogen. The idea was to shoot enough into the balloon so that it would flame and burn up. This wasn't as easy as it sounds, because those of you who know about chemistry probably know that although hydrogen is flammable, it requires a little bit of oxygen mixed with it before it will actually go, so that the ordinary tracer bullet shot into a balloon will just go out and be smothered by the hydrogen in there until it gets enough holes in the balloon to allow some oxygen to mix with the hydrogen. Then it'll flame, of course, tremendously. In order to shoot a big hole in the balloon, which is what you had to do, it required, of course, flying at a stationary object in an absolutely straight line for a considerable number of seconds at an altitude maybe 1,000 or even under 1,000 feet, because they were pulling the balloon down very fast by the time they knew you were attacking it. So you were getting closer and closer to the ground all the time. You were flying in an absolutely straight line, and you were just a perfect target for the machine gunners underneath and the people who had the so-called flaming onions, another thing they used to throw up at us that looked like Roman candles. And you were a perfect target, so it was almost impossible to shoot down a balloon without getting an airplane full of holes. It was not an easy thing to do. I didn't go after many more after the first one.
Excellent. With the British, you were actually the first American ever to be awarded the British Distinguished Flying Cross. Can you tell us something about how you came to be transferred to an American unit after about 3 months of combat experience?
Well, all of these people who went for training with the British, the ones who were the original Italian detachment, I say, were sent out in due course to British squadrons, the same as I was. I happened to be with the 84th Squadron. There were 4 other Americans in the 84th Squadron at the time, and there were similar numbers in various and sundry British squadrons all over the front, the British front. So it was decided that they would form 2 squadrons of Americans who had been trained with the British and who had been at the British front, and they would fly on the British front as part of a British wing. And incidentally, you mentioned the 4th Pursuit Group in the introduction. This was not the 4th Pursuit Group. We belonged to no pursuit group at all at this point. We were attached to a British wing, but there were 2 squadrons, the 17th and 148th, both of which were equipped with Sopwith Camels, and both of which were flying entirely with the British. I've been for 3 months with the 17th Squadron. The British had a regular system of after you'd been flying at the front for 3 months, you were given 2 months leave to go back to London, and this was a major point in the whole career. There's no question about that.
We won't ask any more details.
Okay. So having gone back for 2 weeks, I came back to the 17th Squadron to complete another 3 months, and found that in the meantime, the 17th Squadron, which was made up of entirely of people who had been flying around with the British before, had a pretty tough show 2 weeks before that. They'd lost 6 pilots in one show, and they needed some replacements, and I was transferred from the 84th Squadron British to the 17th American Squadron, but still on the British front as a flight commander. And this involved a change of type of aircraft, because I'd been flying SE-5s, the Sopwith Camels, with the arm of the 17th Squadron and this 148th, which was the other squadron attached to the British. So we had to go through a sort of a transition period from the SE-5 to the Sopwith Camel, which was not quite as easy as it sounded, because there were two entirely different types of aircraft. The SE-5 was a very stable, sturdy, comfortable airplane to fly with a Hispano engine in it, a water-cooled inline engine or a V-type engine, whereas the Sopwith Camel was a light wing-loading, rotary engine aircraft, not easy to fly, had some very nasty flight characteristics which you had to know about in order to step out of one without scratches. In fact, the Sopwith Camel had a very bad reputation as a so-called death trap. The British all thought it was, because of some characteristics that it had of tending to spin into the right as soon as you took off if you pulled the nose up too fast. But as everybody knows, there were many more people killed in crack-ups in World War I than were ever shot down over the lines. And there have been a great many casualties in these Camels. So we were a little apprehensive about changing to Camels, but after we got to know them, they became a very favorite airplane, and we found that they were highly satisfactory combat type of airplane in almost all respects, except they weren't fast enough.
When you changed over to the American unit, or totally manned with American officers, can you contrast the living conditions that you had on the British, with the British units, with those that you experienced when you transitioned to an American unit?
As far as the living conditions were concerned, they were more or less the same, because all of these people were brought up on living in tents. Of course, we hadn't lived in tents in England. We lived sometimes in castles in England and Scotland, wherever we happened to be billeted. But at the front, the usual practice was to house the flight officers in tents, 2 officers to a tent, round type tents. And we had the same equipment when we got to the 17th as far as living conditions were concerned. As far as service concerned, this was a little bit different, because the British, being old soldiers from way back in India and things like that, were accustomed to what they used to call the batman. And he was a personal servant that every British officer had. He, as a rule, was an infantryman who had been invalided back out of the front lines. They wanted to keep him in uniform, but didn't have any combat duties that he could suitably perform. So he was made into a batman, which, for all practical purposes, was just a personal servant for the officer he served, sometimes 2 officers. It was his job to wake you up in the morning, to bring you tea in bed, to shine your boots, to shine your Sam Browne belt, to bring you warm water to shave with. And when you transferred to station, he was the one who always packed your bags and put them down and put them on the transportation and so forth.
It sounds only right to me.
This we didn't get in the American Army. This was entirely a British custom.
Oh.
Although they may have done the same thing. I think maybe they did the same thing in Germany. I think we talked about this last night. I think the Germans had the same system in a way during World War I. I don't know what they did in World War II or not. But anyway, it was not as easy a life personally. But the physical surroundings were practically the same as they were in the British squadron.
Very good. You became a B-flight commander. You were an experienced pilot. You were breaking new pilots into the combat theater, if you will. You made a transition. Now, the transition was rather difficult, but you handled that without any difficulty. Actually, within a month after transitioning to the aircraft, you were engaged in probably one of the largest air battles in September of 1918, and you ended up, in fact, downing 2 aircraft in that engagement and almost got shot down yourself. Can you tell us something about that mission?
Yeah, well, that mission was it was a standard, what we used to call, or what was officially known as offensive patrol. We were flying up and down over the front lines with a squadron at this point consisting of 2 flights of 5 each. The lower flight, maybe these were Sopwith Camels. We didn't fly much over 15,000 feet with a Sopwith Camel, sometimes a little bit higher than that. But the first flight probably about 12,000 feet, and the following flight probably about 15,000 feet, 3,000 feet higher, and maybe a half a mile behind. The idea was that the lower flight was supposed to be a sort of an enticing target for enemy aircraft, and then if the enemy aircraft were had bitten on this target situation, then the people in the back, and the advantage of higher altitude, would come in and try to shoot them down. This is the sort of situation we ran into. There was a German formation flying up and down, paralleling our flying up and down on the other side of the lines, each one wondering who was going to start this thing, if anybody was. Finally, the Germans did start it. They came in and they started diving on our lower formation, and of course there was nothing we could do in the second formation but to fly down and get into the show. Although by this time we had found that there was another German formation of about 18 altogether, Hawkers, D7s, coming up from the south. We saw this before we went into the thing, so we knew we were going to be in a lot of trouble. And sure enough we were, because obviously these fellows had turned the tactics on us. They did exactly what we were trying to do to them. They waited until we were down there, then the rear flight came and piled in on the top of it. So we were pretty badly outnumbered. It was a matter of revving around and getting a shot at anybody you could finally get a shot at, rather than picking any individual aircraft to follow around and have a dogfight with, which were seldom was done anyway, as a matter of fact. But right in the middle of this whole thing, I discovered that my engine wasn't running anymore, which was very disconcerting, to say the least. Well, there's nothing you can do when the engine doesn't run with a Sopwith Camel except get out as quickly as possible. The Sopwith Camel wasn't a fast diving airplane because of its wide frontal area, its rotary engine and so forth. So the fastest way to get a Camel down was put it in spin, which is what I did. Obviously, in a spin, you are not only getting out of the way as quickly as possible, but you're also affording a pretty bad wobbly target rather than a stationary target, which would provide if you were just diving. I went on down in the spin, down and down to actually until the barbed wire of no man's land came up, and about 400 or 500 feet above that, I flattened out of the spin and looked for the area of least barbed wire where I could put this Camel down. And but I had a chance by this time to give a couple of thoughts to other things, and remembered that I had an emergency gas tank, which I might be able to use to get back. I turned this little emergency valve off, and sure enough, the engine took. And I took off at the altitude of about 200 feet across the lines and back home without any trouble at all. Coming in, however, on the home stretch, I was conscious of a sort of a burning feeling in behind the left-hand shoulder. I took off a glove and felt around there. It was soaking wet. And I thought, well, one of these stray shots must have hit me in the shoulder. It won't be too bad. Maybe go back to England for another couple of weeks in the hospital. And with those thoughts all the way home, I landed with almost a smile on my face at the local aerodrome. The mechanic came out, and I saw him looking intently at the fuselage behind me. I looked around, fortunately, before I told him anything at all, so what had happened, and I saw there was a hole about this big, right at the top of the gas tank, which was right behind the seat. Obviously, what had stopped the engine was that they'd shot a hole in the top of the gas tank. Obviously, the burning sensation was gasoline, which was dropped on my flying suit, and that was the end of that vision of a new trip to London. Incidentally, I found out later, one of these World War I aviation buffs, people call themselves the Cross Cockade Society, went to the trouble of going into Germany, collecting a lot of German aircraft, German World War I combat reports, and comparing them with comparable U.S. aircraft reports as to place, time, date, and number of aircraft and all this other thing. He discovered the name of the German fellow who had claimed to have shot me down and got full credit for having shot me down. And I didn't blame him at all, because for all practical purposes he had.
Outstanding, outstanding. You mentioned that you flew offensive patrol as your primary mission. Did you fly any other type missions, ground attack of some kind, and what kind of missions were they? Were they hazardous, or were they milk run, or what was that for you?
They were hazardous, yes. The offensive patrol was flown mostly when the situation was quiet. There wasn't much movement of the front line back and forth. The idea was to keep the sky clear so that our observation aircraft could go over and do their adjustment work with the field artillery and all that sort of thing. When the weather got good, instead of being sent over on offensive patrol, we were sent over what they called ground swapping expeditions, which meant that you would fly very low under the clouds, because in those days, of course, you couldn't fly in clouds. There were no instruments to fly with. So you had to keep contact with the ground, except maybe a brief shot through cloud or something of that kind. But you had to keep below the ceiling, in other words. And you were a pretty good target below a low ceiling, obviously. But we were told to go over and attack convoys on the road, particularly to attack rail junctions, trains coming in and out of rail junctions. We were equipped in some cases with 25-pound bombs, 4 25-pound bombs, tremendous things. Hung onto the fuselage in the special bomb racks that we had. And the bomb racks had wire controls on them so that you could pull those bombs off either one at a time or in salvo all 4 at a time. Of course, there were no bomb sights or anything of that kind. You just looked over the side, and if you saw something down there, you'd pull the handle, hope the bomb went down.
Whatever works.
This is the way we attacked ground targets. Of course, we also went down and machine gunned them when we had an opportunity to, too. But that work was not pleasant. But on the other hand, we didn't have too many casualties with that kind of work either. I said we had about equal amount shot down in the air with those who were shot down from the ground.
Very good. We'll have about time for one more question. We'd like to weave a common thread through all the interviews today about combat leadership and how difficult it was to lead fighter aircraft into combat. Now, it seemed like that would be especially true in the First World War, in which you had no radio communications between aircraft. Can you tell us something about what made a good combat leader, why were some successful, and how you controlled your flight once you entered an air battle, or if you could?
Well, number one, there was nothing like experience to make a good flight commander. And I would say that was the prime requirement. It's a pretty well-known fact that of all the people who were shot down over the lines during World War II, a very high percentage were shot down almost within the first few days they got there, certainly within the first few scraps they had. Anybody who managed to survive the first few scraps was pretty likely to be a pretty good combat leader, because by this time he was experienced and he knew what to do. So the number one requirement, I would say, was experience. The number two requirement was probably, these being offensive patrols, you required a certain amount of aggressiveness, I suppose. But on the other hand, the aggressiveness could be badly overdone too, because you had to remember that behind you, you had people who were not so experienced, and who you had to gauge the type of combat you got into by the capabilities of the people who were flying behind you. If you didn't, you found you had some casualties, and of course you couldn't win a war with the pilots who'd been shot down or were in German prison camps. They were only good as long as they were still with you. So I would say those were the two main qualifications: one, experience, and two, to a very limited extent, a certain amount of aggressive spirit.
Well, Colonel Vaughn, I'd like to thank you for a very interesting insight into the First World War and your experiences there, and for coming all the way down here to grant us one more outstanding interview. Thank you very much.